Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Council's webinar tonight. We're having a discussion, as you know, about the outcomes of the latest Group 3 report.
I have this hand grenade. Great, all
right. And there's someone in the background there. Who's that?
Paul's servant here. I'm going to bring him some pizza once this thing's finished. Hello, Amanda. How are you?
Good to see you.
Great to see you. Really safe hands here. You don't need me. It's great. All right. See you guys. Bye.
Well, before we get started and I introduce our speakers, including Saul, Tim is not one of our speakers tonight. I want to, of course, acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today. And for me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And extend that respect to Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are on the call today. And also pay my respects to First Nations people around the world and acknowledge the important role that they're playing in tackling climate change. So my name's Amanda McKenzie. I'm the founder and CEO of the Climate Council, and I'll be facilitating this session. So the way we're going to run the session is I'm going to do a few key takeaways from the latest IPCC Working Group 3 report, and then I'm going to pass to Saul to give a bit of background as well, and then we're going to do some Q&A. And on the advertisement, we said that Dr. Simon Bradshaw, our senior researcher, would be with us. Unfortunately, he's sick, so he's not going to be with us today, but our panelists have a huge amount of knowledge between them. And in the back end, we've got Carl Tinneman, who is one of our star researchers, who will be answering questions in the chat as well. So there's lots of opportunity to be asking questions and to be having them responded to, in addition to the ones that we're asking. So I'll get started. So firstly, I'm just going to do a kickoff question with both Saul and with Madeline. So if you haven't come across Saul before, he is an inventor, an author and founder of multiple companies and not-for-profits. He has led projects for agencies like NASA and the National Science Foundation. And in 2007, he was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship and the so-called Genius Grant for inventions in the service to humanity, which is very impressive. So welcome to the panel, Saul. As an opening question for you, you've recently moved back to Australia from the United States, and you've thrown yourself into climate advocacy here, including publishing a book titled The Big Switch. Can you tell us a bit about your motivations for returning and what drove you to write a book in Australia?
Moving your whole family transcontinentally is difficult to have a single motivation for. So perchance a lot of it was related to COVID and American politics. But I think the simplest version of the story is I wrote this book in America called Electrify. This was very much written in 2019 to try and help shape the 2020 election and help inform America about what it needs to do to lead the world on climate. And I started an organization called Rewiring America, and we've had a good deal of success and have been helping the White House and a whole bunch of senators and state offices in the US on rapid decarbonization. But while doing all of that work and looking at the economics of and the engineering requirements of getting to zero emissions, it really dawned on me two things. One, America's not going to get there on time. It's going to go slower than we need. And two, Australia, because of its fortuitous climate, incredible renewable resources, can actually lead the world in a way that is not only climate leadership, but will actually be economically fabulous for Australia. And so that led me to write this book, The Big Switch, very specifically about what Australia could do if we decided to lead the world, and by leading the world, improve every other nation's climate ambitions by showing them the recipe for getting to zero emissions in a way that actually improves the lives of everyday Australians.
Amazing, thank you. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Madeline Taylor, and she is a senior lecturer and deputy director of the Centre for Energy and Natural Resources Innovation and Transformation at Macquarie University, and she's also a counsellor here at the Climate Council. Madeline's expertise includes issues at the complex nexus of energy law and policy, and her current research focuses on the law concerning energy conflicts, landholder rights, and the protection of sensitive land issues. So thank you for joining us, Madeline. And I'd love to ask you, you're one of our trusted voices here at the Climate Council. Can you tell everyone about your motivations for moving into the climate space after starting out in law?
Thanks, Amanda. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on beautiful Camaragal land tonight that I'm speaking to you from, and I acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. Well, really, my love for energy and passion around climate came quite early in my career when I was travelling around rural Australia interviewing farmers for a research project. And whilst I was there sampling all this lovely food from these farmers, it dawned on me that there was a real issue at stake. These farmers were telling me that because this was a drought year, this was over 10 years ago now, they were worried about staying on the land. And so instead, they were looking at options for coal seam gas and opening the door for coal seam gas. And this absolutely frightened me. And I delved deeper to realizing that the regulation and policy in terms of climate, protecting the landholders, and obviously the extraction of methane was absolutely dire. And the adaptive way that regulation was structured, particularly in Queensland, just meant that the Darling Downs was and is a sacrificial zone. And so I became very concerned about this and dedicated my career to energy law and climate law and looking at ways in which we can empower communities and the law to ensure a swift transition and decarbonisation. And moving on from that, I became really interested in energy justice and bottom-up movements. And that's when I started working with our fellow councillor, Greg Bourne, on the Fight for the Bight campaign. So to stop drilling at the Great Australian Bight. And that really invigorated my passion for advocacy and action-based research. And through that sort of movement of the Fight for the Bight campaign with so many colleagues, there was a lot of people at stake there who ended up producing enough pressure that Equinor actually withdrew from the Bight. So that was a huge win. And so really I see energy as being a public good, and the law needs to be a tool to enable decarbonisation.
Thank you. That's a really interesting journey that you have been on, and I think reflects many of our journeys of starting with a moment where we're like, wow, is this where things are headed? Oh, I think I should probably be involved in doing something about this. So I wanted to get into the IPCC report now. Working Group 3 is the third in this latest series of IPCC reports. They involve the coming together, we've done other webinars on this, but the coming together of experts across a very broad range of areas. And this one focused on mitigation, assessing methods for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So I wanted to just give you some of the key takeaways from the report that Dr. Simon Bradshaw would have given if he was here. And as I mentioned earlier, he's unfortunately unwell tonight. So the first is that this report found that annual greenhouse gas emissions have continued to rise through the last decade, which of course is not what we want. We want them to be going down. And the currently pledged ambitions that were articulated in the Paris Agreement are not sufficient to limit global temperatures in lines with the goals of that Paris Agreement. So that is obviously significant. It's not new. We know this already. The good news is that emission reduction technologies have made considerable progress across price and deployment. And importantly, that the technologies and solutions required to halve greenhouse gas emissions across the world, including deep reductions in fossil fuel consumption, already exist today. So the lion's share of the solutions are there. It's a question of scale and pace. Then there's a question of to meet internationally agreed goals to limit climate damage. The report articulates clearly that fossil fuel infrastructure must be abandoned and ambitious action must dramatically increase. So they articulate that the pathway to action needs to, at a minimum, halve global pollution by 2030. So it's a big ask, obviously, and the Climate Council have done analysis for the Australian context as to what that means for us and found that we need at least a 75% reduction in emissions. You might have seen this in our report, Aim High, Go Fast, that was launched at the start of this year. And again, a lot of that we can achieve with existing technology that's available now. So what I might do now is pass to Saul. So the IPCC report provides a global assessment of climate change mitigation, but if you can speak specifically to the Australian landscape, can you take us through what kind of position we are in to implement change and what opportunities are available?
Absolutely. Let me hopefully seamlessly go to sharing my screen. If someone can verbally confirm that it's all working out as planned, that would be great.
All right, you're there.
Great. So I prepared these slides for a number of things, but I have started an organization here, Rewiring Australia, so that's where they come from. So talking to the IPCC and urgency, and putting it in the Australian context. So if we look at Australian emissions, we sheet the emissions counting in the world by the fact that a huge amount of our emissions don't count on our tab. That's our exported emissions. That's our exported energy use. What we do are our domestic economy. So these are the emissions from our households, emissions from our small businesses and commercial sector, and things that support our domestic economy. And then what we don't really appreciate is we also, in our domestic economy, do a huge amount of emissions that are effectively activities that we do in Australia, machines that we drive in Australia that create the huge amount of fossil fuels that we export. When I look at this map, I look at it as an engineer. I think about the machines underneath, and I think about what can we do now and what is not quite ready and what has to happen. And to be very, very frank, these green things are the things that we can do now. These were highlighted in the IPCC report. These are largely under the idea of we need to electrify everything. The only realistic pathway to zero emissions for most sectors of the economy is to electrify the end users and to power those end users with green electricity. Electrify your vehicles, electrify your space heaters and water heaters and cooking, and power it with wind and solar. There are still things in Australia like agriculture, manufacturing, construction, steel and aluminum. Those things will yield to technologies that aren't quite ready yet, but that is going to happen in the 2030s. And then the blunt reality of Australia is these things that I've highlighted in red. These are emissions that can only be eliminated once we eliminate our fossil export businesses and burning fossil fuels completely, including the methane leaks associated with doing all of that mining and including fuel combustion that supports mining. So a huge amount of energy in the Australia's domestic economy is using diesel to move coal from one place to another, using natural gas to pump natural gas around and turn it into LNG and those types of activities. So again, just to emphasize that point, we need to focus on what we can do now. In my mind, be doing the research on what we need to develop, that's in orange, and then eliminate fossil fuels completely. So here is our emissions from the worst thing we do, which is all of our coal creating our electricity at the top there. Fossil fuel mining and manufacture. So this is actually fossil fuel that mines all of our coal for that electricity and natural gas and creates coal for our steel, cars and light vehicles. Anyway, emphasizing again here, we need to do what we know how to do now. And why is that? So let me try and unpack the IPCC report to you in hopefully one simple picture and translate the emissions trajectories, which the IPCC talks about, into everyday experience. So an emissions trajectory is a simulation of a pathway that the IPCC thinks we should take to get to a climate outcome, for example, 1.5 or 2 degrees. These three blue lines, P1, P2, P3, they're three of the emission scenarios. These are called low overshoot, meaning we don't go too far over 1.5 and we don't need a huge amount of negative emissions below this 0 point. The pathway P4, just to emphasize a point that I think is worth saying, the IPCC is itself imperfect. Part of its imperfections are things that Australia caused by lobbying for negative emissions to be counted in overwhelming quantities. It's extremely unlikely that the world could achieve that P4 target, that would require using 15% of world energy to process that carbon into negative emissions, and it would require about 7% of the global land area, which would have a huge collision with agriculture. So really, we have to stay on one of these P1, P2 paths. Fast and early emission reductions are vital. This is why you hear the 50 to 75% reductions by 2030, so that we don't have a huge amount of overshoot, and we only need small amounts of negative emissions that are probably manageable just by reforming our agricultural pathways. Again, let's try to make this, really contextualize this for Australians in a way that I think is important. The things that we know how to do right now that get rid of the 3/4 of the world's emissions are end use electrification, and then powering those end uses with renewables and nuclear power. The harder 25% of our emissions to eliminate are air travel, beef, agriculture, nitrous oxide emissions, refrigerants, steel, aluminum, and cement. Nearly all of these, we have answers that are coming. They're likely a decade away, but we can't squander this decade by having hydrogen policies and negative emissions policies in Australia and not focusing on the first thing, which is what we can do now. And finally, we need to get to negative emissions later. So to translate this to you in terms of your community, it really means the things that we do in our everyday lives, we need to get to zero emissions, the majority by 2030 and completely by 2040. And let's talk about that in terms of the nuts and bolts of your daily life. So there's roughly 6 machines in every Australian household that cause 42% of our electric emissions. They're our cars, our space heaters, our water heaters, our kitchen appliances, and where we get the electricity to power our homes from. The awkward reality of the IPCC report, and I was glad this was the first time that they mentioned this. It's an idea called committed emissions. So if you bought a Volvo last year that uses petrol, it's going to last for 20 more years, and it's going to commit emissions to the world over those 20 years. If you bought a hot water heater last year that runs on gas, it's going to live another 10 or 12 years. That's committed emissions. The machines that exist and live in the world today, in our homes and our basements all over the world, are enough, if we let them live out their natural life, to take us to 1.8 degrees. So we need to, as soon as possible, get to the idea that every time we are replacing a water heater, or we're close to it, or every time we're replacing a car, we must replace these with zero emission options to stay on that red target. So these blue, green, and purple lines here are the idea that literally starting tomorrow in 2022, no one can buy a new petrol or diesel car in Australia. No one can buy a new natural gas space heater. No one can buy a new natural gas water heater. That needs to be our mantra. It needs to be electrify everything. It needs to be doing it immediately. That sounds intimidating, and I think a lot of Australians then get concerned about, well, I can't afford this. It sounds too hard. I don't have the money right now today. And I think something that could make you breathe a little easier. I was sent a lovely email from somebody who was watching me give this talk, and they said that their family planned or pledged net zero by 2025, and they made that plan. Get solar this year, that will eliminate a whole bunch of emissions. There's good rebates, finance that. Then in the following 2 years, do the stove and the water heater. That doesn't sound too intimidating, because they're waiting for the battery prices to drop in 2024. And then get a car in 2025, after which they've eliminated probably 80% of their emissions, and the remaining are because of what they eat, how they compost, and where they bank. And so they have a plan to get to zero. I think this is marvelous, because you can now imagine, in an abstract sense, every household in Australia making this plan. I'll get an electric bike this year. I'll wait a year to next year. I'll get the average Australian household has 1.8 cars. We'll get an electric car next year. We'll upgrade the main electrical panel the same year to help charge the car. That will prepare us for all of the other upgrades to the house, increasing the rooftop solar, buying green electricity for the balance of it from the grid, electrifying the water heater when it fails in 2026, because my wife bought one 3 years ago, so it's not that far away. I don't want to replace it yet. Electrify the cooking in 2027, the battery, the space heater. You can now imagine taking those plans and stacking them up. Everyone will have a slightly different plan in their household, But if we can all have this plan, now remember, everyone's going to replace both their cars in the next 15 years. Everyone's going to replace all their cooking equipment in the next 15 years. Everyone's going to replace these things anyway. That is the natural rate of replacement. If we just make sure we're replacing them with the right electric items, that we have optimized government policy at local, state, and federal level to make sure that's the lowest cost option, then we can actually hit our climate targets in Australia, because the first big piece of this, we are the leading country in the world to do. That's our very cheap rooftop solar. We could lead the world and actually demonstrate the pathway to truly zero emission households, truly zero emission communities, and then by virtue of doing that at scale across the nation, getting the country on target. This is what's required to stay on target. This is a little anathema to a lot of environmental politics because we've spent 50 years talking about efficiency, but I think we need to get comfortable with that we're probably not going to bring the majority of people along unless we think of this as an abundance agenda, right? This is the pathway to eliminating all of our climate emissions, creating jobs, because every single one of those water heaters has to be installed by a tradie. Every single one of those cars is going to come with a vehicle charger that needs to be installed by a Sparky. All of those jobs and then the savings that I'll talk about in a minute are going to revitalize community economics and save money for households. I think we need to start telling the positive vision for what Australia has to win, because we've lost the politics of the negative vision for Australia and what we have to lose over the past few decades. Sorry. Here we go. Okay. 42% of our emissions come from our households, 65% if we include our small businesses. These are the decisions we made around the kitchen table. Our castles are our infrastructure. We need the 20th century infrastructure, by definition, was coal plants, was transmission lines, was natural gas pipelines. We need to rethink the very definition of infrastructure. We give privileged access to finance and credit to infrastructure. We now need to give privileged access to finance and credit as a nation to the infrastructure of our homes so that we can replace the natural gas, the petrol, diesel, and the coal-fired electricity that's coming to our homes with infrastructure that works. To get to that zero emissions, we have to electrify the demand side machines. So I'm just going to repeat the mantra here, and then we have to supply it with clean electricity. That means electrifying the 1.8 vehicles in the driveway, electrifying the water heat, electrifying the space heat, electrifying the kitchen, putting solar on the roof, batteries on the side of our houses, and upgrading our main panels and distribution grid to suit, and then supplying green electricity, solar, wind, hydroelectricity, perhaps even nuclear, definitely nuclear in other parts of the world, to get to zero emissions completely. The fantastic thing for Australians is this will cut our energy use by more than half. So the efficiency we were searching for the last 50 years that evaded us is actually baked into the process of electrification. That's because driving an electric car, same size truck, uses less than 1/3 of the energy of the petrol or diesel equivalent when it's run from clean electricity. Our water heaters, if we use heat pumps, will use less than 1/3 of the energy of the natural gas water heaters we use today. Same with space heaters or mini split systems. They use about 1/3 or 1/4 of the energy of using natural gas to heat our homes. Same with the kitchen. It's about half the energy to use electric induction that it is to use natural gas. And the biggest saving of all in Australia is on the left over there. That's our coal and our natural gas generators. Only about 1/3 of the energy that goes into those plants is converted into electricity. If we're, by comparison, using solar and wind to generate our electricity, we save 2/3 of that waste. All of that means this happens to the Australian household. On the left there is all of the energy and all emissions of the Australian household today. It's the oil creating the petrol and diesel on top there. It's the natural gas for the heating systems, and it's the natural gas and coal for the electricity. 102 kilowatt hours per household per day is current. Our energy use will go down to 37 kilowatt hours per day if we electrify everything. So the energy use goes down, the electricity use goes up. But actually that is the source of the savings that we will see let's talk about the economics briefly. This is the average Australian household last year before Putin increased the price of petrol from $1.48 to $1.90. Of the average $80,000, the average household spends on everything. $5,000 is on energy. That is not a huge burden for the top 20% of households, only about 4% of spending. It's about 8% of spending for the bottom 20% of households. So it's quite meaningful to them. But this is what the IPCC report emphasized. This is what's called a learning curve, or learning by doing industrial curve of cost savings. Every time you double the amount of solar produced in the world, cost falls 22% every time. And we know this because we've been tracking it for 3 decades. Every time we double the amount of wind energy we make, the price drops by 14%. Batteries drop by 20% every time we double it, and electric vehicles by 21%. We need 10 to 16 times the production of all of these things to get the world to zero emissions. And that project alone more than halves the cost of all the things we need to do to solve the problem. So literally solving climate change creates the savings we need to make it economic. Just to emphasize that in terms of the Australian household, there's the total cost of energy for the Australian household in 2021, a little over $5,000. This year it's going up to close to $7,000 because the increasing price of fuel. This year, because the electric vehicles are expensive, because the batteries are still expensive, after financing, your cost of energy would be $11,000 if you went all electric, but you can see how rapidly that is decreasing. Honestly, by 2024, nearly every household in Australia will be at the break-even point, after which we are saving $3,000 to $5,000 a year per household for this all-electric future. This future can only happen if we make the regulatory environment work for it, and if we commit as a nation to this pathway for dealing with our emissions. This would get our domestic emissions to zero. Honestly, we should be able to do this by 2035 for our domestic emissions, and buy ourselves enough time to solve those other industrial emissions. To be really blunt and reduce it to everyday experience, you're driving a petrol car today that costs you 12 cents a kilometer. If you have an electric car already and you're powering it off the solar on your rooftop, it's 1 cent a kilometer. And that drives the good economics. This is the good news story in the IPCC. Again, if you take a long, luxurious 8-minute shower today in Australia on natural gas, it's 66 cents. The same shower off your solar with a heat pump would cost you 6 cents. And you can see it for space heat, about a third of the price. And even for boiling a cup of tea or cooking, it's, if you can run it off your own solar, it's 8 times cheaper. Even if you're running off the grid, it's about 30% cheaper. So to do all that, we've got to get granular. We can no longer have vague targets about this industry and that industry. We need to have granular targets about communities, and we need to have pilot projects that are actually showing that all of this works. And we need to nip in the butt the criticisms of, for example, the generators that will say, oh, you can't do that, that'll crash the grid, it'll lower the voltages, this or that or the other. They're not even doing their homework to model what can work. So we just need to call that bluff. We should be demanding of this political moment that Australia leads the world, runs these pilots, proves the technology readiness, proves the economics for households and communities, proves the social license that this is good and people will accept this as a climate solution, do the training, the supply chain, the labor, the certification, the capacity building, and then very critically, because close to half of the cost of our energy systems is in the regulatory systems, is optimize our regulatory systems for this new electric future and get rid of 150 years of regulations that we wrote to help fossil fuels. So we're starting still with a tilted playing field because the regulations were written for the incumbent. So I'm actually optimistic with all of that because I know we can now do it. It just requires genuine climate leadership at a scale that Australia obviously has failed at for 30 years. We need to electrify everything, rewire Australia. We can do it commensurate with the climate reality. To be very blunt, if we don't embark on this project within this electoral time period, the next 3 years, the opportunity to stay below 2 degrees will be missed.
Thank you. And so maybe keep your presentation open because I've got a few questions of clarification that you might want to go back to particular slides. Or maybe you won't. I wanted to just clarify with the fugitive emissions graph, whether you were talking about 1 tonne of methane being equivalent to 28 or 84 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent.
This is 44 megatons, which is the reported Australian total economic reported emissions by our IPCC reporting requirements. Almost certainly this is an underestimate as per the new science coming out of the US of the Permian Basin, for example, which is emitting at about 6 times the rate that the America has been reporting to the IPCC. We know that we're even worse in our practices around coal seams and fracking. So very likely that number is a huge underestimate.
Yeah, thank you. And Caroline was asking about the household emissions in this graph and estimating that that was about 1/4 of all of the emissions coming from Australia, and wanted to clarify that that was correct.
Again, it depends whether you count the emissions that we export down here on our tab or not. Currently, they are not counted against us. The emissions required to generate those overseas emissions are counted on our tab. So, you know, it is a little more than 1/4 of our household. If you add commercial, it's about half. If you eliminate these, if you eliminate these energy exports down here, you eliminate everything except the agricultural component of our trade emissions.
Yeah.
So it really puts it bluntly, not only do you need to make this good news story around our household and commercial emissions, but you need to create a new narrative for how Australia will thrive on exports, because it will be over my cold dead body that people stop this unless you can tell them a story about how we create green metals using excess wind and solar and become a renewable superpower to offset the $80 billion in export revenue that this generates. That is the political hurdle in Australia.
There was a few questions about steelmaking, and Bethany asked a question about the understanding that metallurgical coal was used for steel making and whether there are alternatives now, what it takes to have alternatives being created in Australia.
So there's nothing being created in Australia, and we've underinvested in steel, given how important it is to our economy. There are, however, 2 prototype processes that can do zero emission steel without using coal. One of them is the ThyssenKrupp process being developed in Northern Europe that uses hydrogen as the reductant. I say all of this because actually my first degree was paid for by BHP and my first job was on the steel rolling mill in Newcastle. So I am in fact a steel man by training. We can now make steel with hydrogen. There's another process actually developed by a professor that I had at MIT called Dan Sadoway. That is a company called Boston Metals. Instead of using hydrogen as the reductant, they use the ultimate cleanest reductant of all, which is the electron. They use electrochemistry to reduce iron ore directly into iron. That uses about 25% less energy than any other process to get to steel. I don't know how many people know about this about steel, but 1/3 to 1/2 of the cost of steel is the cost of the energy that is produced to make it. So to be very blunt, the opportunity for Australia is we will have the cheapest wind energy and solar energy in the world. If we use that cheapest wind and solar energy in the world to use electricity to reduce iron ore into iron, instead of exporting 99% of our iron ore, we should be converting the majority of it into iron or steel domestically. As an export value, that would be worth $800 billion, 10 times more than all of our current fossil fuel exports. You don't need much imagination, you just need determination in Australia to have us absolutely thrive. The rest of the world will struggle because Australia is the only country with a very low population density and extraordinary renewables, so we can produce green energy in excess. The rest of the world needs us to become its foundry, because in Northern Europe, they're going to struggle to get to 100%. In America, they're going to struggle to get 100%. We can be 500, 600, 700% renewable.
And we can still be mining. So can you tell me, there's quite a few questions on the issue of renting and what renters do within your framework.
So the Australian economy domestically is very much about the Ponzi scheme called Australia Real Estate. I'm not sure if you meant to say it that bluntly, but we all enjoy very liberal federal fiscal policy that supports home ownership for 70-ish, 75% of households. For those people who have a mortgage, financing this new infrastructure, and I use that word very carefully, alongside the mortgage on your house, it will almost be like a de minimis, the amount of money to buy these electric things. You know, most people have $1 million mortgage. We're talking about today about $80,000 worth of things, in the future like $30,000 worth of things that they could be financing and affording, and then realizing those savings. So that can work for most homeowners. Honestly, for the wealthiest 20% of Australian households, if you are buying a foreign imported luxury vehicle like a Volvo or Range Rover today, you are consciously choosing not to be a zero emission household, because you could just buy an electric Hyundai instead, and with the spare change buy all of the other things that render your household emissions zero. So there's the solution for the top 20% and the middle 60% of Australia. The difficult component is for renters. So how do you pass these savings? Because there will be these savings in those households that renters live in. How do we make sure they get passed through to the renters? That a lot of that will be regulatory, determined by regulations. To be really frank, however, most renters will enjoy the majority of the benefits by virtue of being vehicle owners, because of the $3,000 to $5,000 a year in savings, the majority comes from that extraordinary arbitrage between 1 to 3 cent per kilometer electric cars versus 15 cent per kilometer petrol cars. So I think really this question is the most important question. And in some respects, you know, I haven't given you a satisfying answer because I don't have all the answers, but I think you have to recognize that it's a political question, because politics will determine who is the winner of this windfall. I think this question is ultimately the environmental justice, social justice question. It should be obvious to everyone on this call that you don't half solve climate change. If only the 50% richest households in Australia and around the world can afford the solutions, we don't get there. And even worse, you're already seeing the political wedges driven around cost of living that are trying to divide electorates everywhere in the world, because only those rich people can afford the Teslas. So I think, to me, environmental justice now means fiscal policy, economic policy about how do you help everyone afford to get to this future. And if you remember the slide I showed you back up here, this slide, the households that stand to benefit the most from the economic windfall that could be created if we were 100% renewable are low-income households. So it's an economic justice as well as an environmental justice question at this point. And, you know, as an engineer and physicist, I'm delighted that you asked me that question, but I think we actually need to get our sharpest minds on figuring this one out, because I think this is it's where we might fail, because it could create a cultural wedge unless we have really solid answers to that.
Yeah, thank you. Now I'm just going to ask you two quick but curly questions prior to bringing Madeline in, because there was a huge amount of questions coming through during your presentation. I'm conscious that there is a lot that you've got across, and you're have just published a book, so there's a lot of opportunity to get into it in more detail, and also we'll share the slides if that's okay with you afterwards. And we'll share the presentation rather than the slides. We'll share the presentation afterwards, the recording. So there's quite a lot of questions about agriculture and whether electrification is more important than agriculture. A lot of people asserting that animal agriculture is key, is changing diets important. How do you weigh up the different considerations within that table and where agriculture sits?
Agriculture is enormously important, but you know, I'm not trying to say that anything is better or worse than itself, the other. Maybe I should just give you the narrative version. I just drove an electric vehicle from Sydney to Adelaide, Adelaide to Melbourne, Melbourne to Hobart and back. And if you in driving across that landscape, thinking about electrification, thinking about how you can eliminate all of the emissions from electrification, you have enough time to realize that the real scar on the landscape, Australian landscape, is cows and sheep. What has really ruined and deforested this nation? What has ruined the soils? It's our agricultural practices. Having said that, you know, if we believe the way we measure it, which I suspect you should be slightly skeptical of, agricultural emissions are only about a fifth or a sixth of our reported emissions from energy in Australia. So I put agriculture in the bucket of, we don't quite know how to do it yet. It's orange. It's the thing we need to figure out this decade. I can give you a solution for everything in your life except for the meat that you're eating today. Unless, you know, I say vegetarianism, and I'm doing my best to get there, but I'm not there yet. But, you know, maybe the CSIRO process where we feed seaweed as a component of feed to cows will actually turn out to be true. And that is a get out of jail free card, at least on the emission side of it. But the land use side, we should still question. I think, you know, if I was going down the culturally difficult questions, I think I leave the most difficult question comes around cultural practices and diet. So, you know, I appreciate the question. I'm going to dodge it a little by saying it's not the biggest piece of the pie. I do think there are some technological solutions on the way. I think we are chipping away at some of the behavior changes, but I think it will still be the most difficult cultural issue a decade from now. So I'm hoping that we're buying ourselves enough time with near-term electrification of the majority of our emissions, which is our energy economy, so we can figure it out.
Thank you. Madeline, I'm going to pass to you now. We've having that conversation about agriculture versus electricity, etc. There's obviously so much that we need to do at once, and fossil fuels, as the Climate Council, we've been advocating that has to be, that's the big first step, but we need to be doing everything simultaneously. I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit more about gas. Australia is obviously one of the largest exporters of fossil fuels, as we saw in Sol's slides, and we're heavily reliant on them. Can you talk us through the kinds of changes we'll need to see in our energy sector to combat climate change in the coming years, and particularly focus on how we get out of gas?
Sure, thanks, Amanda. So as Sol has just been through, obviously electrification, 100% renewables-based electrification is the first thing that we need to do. We're on our way in Australia. We're about, in the 30% mark for renewables, but that's nowhere near good enough. And we need to ramp up a grid that's capable of holding 100% renewable energy, which will be by 2025, according to the market operator. And we need to be doing that essentially initially now. So the IPCC reports highlights the good news, like Sol just said, about the...
If I can just make one clarifying point, because I think this is really missed by everyone in the Australian electorate. Getting our existing electricity system to 100% renewables is about 1/3 of the project.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't had in the conversation what has to happen on electrifying the demand side of machinery, our homes, our cars, our things. That is going to triple the amount of electricity we need. If we also electrify industry in Australia, we probably need 400 or 500% of the electricity we're producing today. So it is not enough to give either of the major parties any credit for announcing 100% renewables, because what they mean is the minimum effort, which is just the existing grid, and that's not enough.
Right, and we need the transmission lines as well, obviously, to ramp up this amount of renewable electricity that we need for electrification. So that's the obvious one, and that's the kind of silver lining out of the IPCC report, is the costs plummeting, particularly for solar, around 85%. And then moving from that, looking at the hard to abate industries, this is where it gets really difficult, and where we need to look at alternative fuel stocks to gas. Now, gas is not a very important part of the national electricity market in Australia at all. It's only about 7%, and it's absolutely rapidly decreasing at the moment. The majority of the gas that we produce in Australia, over 80%, is exported for LNG. And that is why we've had historically very high gas prices in Australia for a long time, and now they're being made worse, of course, with the energy crisis overseas. So how to essentially get rid of these hard to abate areas, that is a job for hopefully renewable hydrogen. Now, hydrogen's been around for a long time. but it's been grey hydrogen. It's been based on steam, methane reforming of gas and coal. And so what we're seeing now is the need to ramp up towards renewable hydrogen to essentially replace any need for gas. And we're seeing that happening, which is great, but it's being led majority by industry and not government. Instead, we see things like what happened today with Barnaby Joyce, announcing a new LNG export facility in the Northern Territory, and that's simply what we don't need. The Beetaloo gas program, as part of the gas-fired recovery itself, is going to increase our greenhouse gas emissions by about 13 to 14%, just that one expansion program. So we need to stop greenfield oil and gas and coal developments. We know this from the IEA, the International Energy Agency, but also the IPCC makes it really, really clear that basically the fossil fuel infrastructure that we have right now, that alone is going to bring us over 1.5 degrees. So the window is closing. We need to be electrifying everything, like Saul says, but also looking at alternatives like renewable hydrogen for these really hard to abate industries like transport and others. And then finally, EVs. Obviously, EVs, like Saul has talked about, is extremely important. We don't have a federal target around EVs at all in Australia. That's something we desperately need to ensure that people are able to get the affordability of an EV and also to be able to quickly switch onto EVs and away from any sort of combustion engine.
Thank you. And I think what's been, I suppose, one of the interesting components of the debate where we're moving, there's been so much emphasis from climate advocacy groups in the last few years on let's put climate on the agenda. Now that we've moved into the solutions space much more firmly, there's now a push on a range of different false solutions. Can you tell us about what we need to be wary of, what is being pushed by the fossil fuel companies in particular? Start with Madeline and then Saul, you can jump in too.
I'm not sure if Saul's going to say the same thing, but one of those is CCS and blue hydrogen. Of course, that's being touted and having millions of dollars poured into it, billions rather, in Australia in particular. And that is just not what
made with gas.
Yeah, exactly. So hydrogen made with gas or coal, as has been traditionally used in places like Canada, and CCS, which is traditionally used for oil enhanced recovery. These sorts of things is not what we need at all. What we need is renewable hydrogen, which is powered by renewable energy, of course, and through electrolysis. And this is what we need, electrolysis rather. We don't need blue hydrogen and CCS essentially. So that's one of the really important things. The other thing is around greenwashing. Businesses, private industry really greenwashing and setting net targets and really saying misleading statements around decarbonisation. And climate litigation is alive and well in Australia. It's one of the things that IPCC picked up actually, is that we are the second highest rate of climate action in Australia after the US, which is amazing when we don't have a Bill of Rights. So that's actually something we can be proud of in Australia, that we've got this climate litigation going. And one of those is of course, against Santos and its misleading and deceptive conduct of its greenhouse gas emissions. And the UN has just actually produced a panel to look into this 18-person panel for the first time. So that's another really important thing that we need to do is stop the greenwashing. And I'll hand over to Saul now.
Absolutely. We should have huge limits on our expectations from carbon sequestration. And remember that there are multiple groups that are disingenuously looking for that. So the IPCC's models for all of those negative emissions are to actually do drawdown from overshooting our climate targets. The fossil fuel companies think, however, that all of those negative emissions get to offset their positive emissions. Like, these two things cannot be true. So there's a giant lie there, and it's physically not possible. I'm sorry to contradict Dr. Taylor a little bit. I think Australia has to be enormously wary of this hydrogen thing that they believe is going to happen. Firstly, it's not a near-term solution for anything. And I say this as somebody who developed the hydrogen tanks that I've sold to all of the world's vehicle companies. And I have built hydrogen compressors for the US Department of Energy to lower the amount of energy to compress hydrogen. There are very few things that hydrogen obviously will work for. One of them, which is great, is 1% of the world's energy uses, which is making ammonia. Fantastic. Australia could make all of the world's ammonia with excess renewables. That would be a good thing to do with hydrogen. It is unlikely that hydrogen will be used for any transportation at any meaningful scale. it is unlikely that it will be used at any meaningful scale for industrial heat processes or etc. The problem with hydrogen is if I take 1 unit of really cheap Australian solar energy or 1 unit of really cheap Australian wind power, I lose 25 to 30% converting into hydrogen. I lose another 15% by compressing it. I lose another couple of percent transporting it, and then I lose another half of it turning it back into something I can use, which is heat or electricity. So the reality is it's going to be at least 3 times as expensive as anything we can do through an all electrification pathway. I see hydrogen getting the lion's share of the subsidies and the rebates and the money from Australian climate policy. And honestly, it is just a subsidy to the gas industry because it rhymes with gas. It's not a good idea in Australia. And we need to, by Australia subsidizing hydrogen hubs, we are not subsidizing the electrification of Australian households, which is more near-term, stronger, more guaranteed emissions. We are making a huge national mistake.
Thank you. I wanted to come into imagining a scenario that either of you, after the next election, happen to become the Prime Minister. Something's gone Australia, maybe your name's on the ballot and you're now in charge. What would be the first 3 things that you'd be doing to put Australia on a path to reducing our emissions as significantly as the IPCC says we need to do? Saul, do you want to kick off?
I think we need to focus on the domestic economy with electrification of everything. I think there's 3 things that you need to do. You need to reform the national electricity market so that every household is treated as fairly as a large generator or transmission or distributor company and can feed back to the grid as much energy as it produces and can store as much energy as it wants, and there are no limitations on that. So we need to level the playing field so that every household can play like a generator. We need to have an electric vehicle policy so that we are not at the end of the list for the international automotive companies who've deprioritized Australia because we have no emission standards on our vehicles. And that way, by getting to the front of the list, we could in fact create the most savings for Australia. Remember, this is also a national security issue. We import 100% of our oil. Economically, it's a disaster. All of the coal, all of the natural gas that we export, the profits on that do not add up to the amount of money we spend buying oil. Do you want to know the greatest tragedy of the Australian energy and policy debate is that we don't make net money on our fossil fuel industry. We lose money on it because we import it all in all. So the second most important thing is an electric vehicle policy. And then we need to, I'm going to pack 5 things into the last one, but they're all the same.
Yeah.
The grand success for Australia was our rooftop solar policy. Everywhere else in the world looks at Australia's rooftop solar policy. It's known as the Australian solar miracle in the US because it generates electricity that's delivered to the end consumer at 5 to 6 cents per kilowatt hour. That's a quarter of the cost of the grid here. It's a third of the cost of the grid in America. It's the cheapest electricity that the end consumer has anywhere in the world is our rooftop solar. We did that with a certification and training program that built capacity and eliminated green tape. We had wise subsidy and rebate programs to establish the early market. If we just do that for heat pumps for water heat, heat pumps for space heat, electric vehicle charging, and electrification in our kitchens, we'll build the capacity that we need in terms of training our tradies. We'll lower the soft costs that will make it cheaper for Australians. And we will have the capacity to get this job done by 2032.
Wow, that was very powerful. Thank you. Madeline, what would be your top 3?
I would say to add to that, we need a stronger 2030 target. We need a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. It needs to be legislated for. All of our climate policy needs to be legislated for at the federal level. We also need a legislated target around EVs, like what Saul has just been saying. All EVs should be electrified and there by 2030. That should be our target, similarly to what we've got in the UK and our other developed nations allies. And I think finally, the most important thing is that we need a just transition. We talked about this briefly in this conversation today, but we need a just transition. Canada's really taking leadership here. Canada's actually producing legislation for a just transition to really put people and Indigenous voices at the heart of the transition. That's what we need. The IPCC report is clear. For the first time, it's actually produced a chapter looking at social benefits and social harms and equity, and looking at the vulnerability of Indigenous people and women in climate change. That's what we need to be centering on in this transition. It's not just technical, it's political, as we've been talking about today, but it's also social, and it's about justice, procedural justice, and ensuring that all of the voices are counted and heard, and it needs to be backed by law. No more of these flimsy targets and throwaway lines, but it actually needs to be legalized. These are the sorts of things that we need to have, and that the next Australian government must do if we are going to avoid the worst catastrophes of climate change.
Thank you. Those are both really powerful responses. We're coming to the end of our time. So I just wanted you both to do a final reflection of about a minute, which is contextualized with the IPCC report coming down and offering us both the scary parts and the hopeful parts, as well as the planning and thinking that you two have been doing about how our country could move forward after an election. What's the things that are giving you the most hope going forward from here? What's a top line reflection for you? Madeline, do you want to go first?
I think one of the most powerful things about the IPCC report is just what I've stated there around a just transition. I was so heartened to see that CEDMOB, Australia's youth climate justice movement, was being mentioned in the IPCC, to see all of the theories that we've been talking about for a long time in the literature as academics around a just transition really featuring. That gave me a lot of hope, coupled with obviously the figures around the decrease in costs of renewables. That was obviously a great thing. The other thing that's really interesting about the IPCC report is its real focus on cities, and its real focus on the marginalization of greenhouse gas emissions. So the top 10% of the world's wealthiest population produces the most greenhouse gas emissions. And it really targets cities as one of the first places that can really decarbonize, looking at green spaces, electrification, building standards, phasing out gas, like the city of Yarra is going to be doing, and it's legislating for that by 2030. New York's done it, San Francisco's done it. These are the sorts of things that we need to be emphasizing and highlighting. So I was really, really heartened to see the climate justice movement really focusing and being prominently pushed out by the IPCC. Obviously, the negatives, we're not on track for 1.5 at all. We're staring down the barrel of 2 degrees to 3 degrees. So this should really be a warning sign for everybody. Our window is closing. The time to act is now, as Sol and I have been saying. And I think that the message is clear. We've got the technology, we've got everything. What stands in the way at the moment is politics and getting the regulatory settings right.
Thank you. Sol, what's your 2 cents?
I have optimism in 2 places. I just spent 18 months being beaten up by Joe Manchin and American politics. And the best day of my life in the last 2 years was when Joe Biden announced the first climate science-based target for a major developed nation ever by announcing 50% reductions by 2030. America is not even remotely on track for that. The Democrats are facing uphill wins in 2022 and 2024. You should be placing your expectations for America's emissions to be 15 to 20%, not 50% reductions by 2030. America is not going to be the climate leader we needed it to be. That is partly my answer to your very first question, why did I move to Australia? Australia, by virtue of having a mild climate, which makes our heat pumps more efficient, having higher cost fossil fuels here because our distribution networks are larger and we have to import all of our oil, and because we have extraordinarily good renewable resources, we have the easiest setup of any nation in the world to get to zero emissions. We are indeed the luckiest country in every possible way. When you look at the economics of this transition, it works in Australia in 2024, 2025 for average people. In the US, that looks like 2027, 2028. In Europe, it looks like 2030, maybe. So my optimism and my reason for being in Australia is we have the opportunity to gift to the world the pathway for the reduction of the majority of emissions through domestic economy electrification of households and small businesses, empowering it with renewables, and showing that technology mixes. So I'm hugely optimistic about Australia's role in leading the world. If we did that, and I've seen this because I engage with climate politics in Europe, in North America, and in Australia, you see, and in fact, Dr. Taylor just said it, mentioned the San Francisco example and the New York example on natural gas bans. Ambition begets ambition. And there is every reason to believe that Australia showed the pathway. Look, we have a pathway to zero emissions. Look, it's better air quality in our communities and our children are healthier. Look, we're also saving money. Look, instead of a community of 1,000 households spending $4 million a year on petrol, they're saving all of that money and generating the majority of the electricity for their cars on their own roofs. And consequently, they've got $2 million a year in that community left over to buy a new classroom and install a new surf lifesaving club, right? This could be Australia showing the world not only the pathway to zero emissions, but how to improve geopolitics and local economics by virtue of not having these fossil fuel economies that corrupt things. That really is an enormous opportunity for Australia to lead the world. So I'm optimistic about that. The last thing that I'm even more optimistic about, I'm going to paraphrase, but it's the Country Women's Association. So I just drove around Australia and I visited a lot of our regional centres and I visited a lot of cities, and everywhere I go, it is women of all ages leading on climate action, creating the Electrify My Community programs, running the community battery programs, running the community solar programs. To paraphrase again, or to joke a little bit about it, it's like the Country Women's Association has decided men have screwed up and aren't going to get the job done, and they don't have their egos tied up in the V8, so they've sat down, they've made some cucumber sandwiches, and they're just going to get the job done. I think in some respects, metaphorically, this is why we have such an astounding set of independent candidates, the majority of whom are women who are fighting on a climate platform. I actually trust the practical women of Australia who can see a pathway here to helping their kids have a future and to improving their communities, getting this job done and leading the world and showing the world how to do it. And I am, if there's a sort of an unusual horse to bet on in the world improving its climate game, it's that.
Thank you. That's brilliant. And I know we're running a couple of minutes over, so I'll just quickly finish up by firstly thanking our panelists. That was brilliant and inspiring from both of you. I really enjoyed it and learnt a lot. And to thank everyone that jumped on and listened and put in your questions and engagement. I apologize for not getting to all the questions. If you're watching the chat, you'd have seen that there was a huge amount coming through. Remember that you can email us at info@climatecouncil.org.au, and that you can email us those questions so we can answer them. We will send out a recording of the webinar, and also with a whole range of resources that have come through in the comments section. This is a really exciting time. I think a lot of the questions that were coming through were about, well, what should I do? And now we're at a time where there's lots of different exciting pathways forward. And I think Saul's articulated for us a very clear and compelling one. And there's a range of other exciting ways forward as well. So I think I feel a lot of hope leaving this discussion. A great way to get involved in the fight for climate action is to, of course, support the Climate Council. As you may know, we do a whole range of different work in advocating for change and in changing the public conversation on climate change. So please support us. And I'll bid you all good night. I can hear my kids in the bath, which is what I'm, they're why I'm here doing this work. And I'm sure many of you have got to get to kids and pets and other things. So thank you very much for being a part of it tonight. And thank you again, Saul and Madeline. And thank you everyone who's been with us.